I had always thought of my life as a series of temporary stops, none of which I intended to linger at longer than necessary. The underwater hotel had been just another of those stops, 5 days' work, maybe a week if things dragged on, then back to the mainland. I was never the type to commit to luxury or leisure. My work was my leisure, and my leisure was often the same as my work. But when I first stepped through the glass doors and into the lobby, I felt a kind of awe that I hadn't known in years. The lobby was a cathedral of muted blues and greens, the kind that made your chest loosen and your pulse slow. A massive transparent dome arched overhead, showing the swaying tendrils of kelp, darting schools of fish, and the occasional shark cruising lazily by. It was like walking inside a living aquarium, the hum of the filtration systems the only sound that broke the serene silence. Check-in had been effortless. There were no long queues or rude receptionists. A small robot, almost humanoid but clearly mechanical, handed me the keycard to my suite with a polite tone that sounded eerily human. I nodded, thanked it, and took the elevator down to the lower levels. My suite was far from what I considered necessary. Large, minimalistic yet decadent in its attention to detail. Floor-to-ceiling windows, soft ambient lighting that mimicked the shifting hues of the sea, and the faint scent of sea salt in the air. I unpacked lightly, shoved my laptop and a few personal effects into the closet, and wandered down to the observation tube. The hotel had massive, transparent tubes that ran like veins throughout the building, allowing guests to walk beneath the ocean. I stepped inside, shoes clicking softly on the metal flooring, and immediately felt the surreal calm that came from watching the ocean life move above me. A school of silverfish glimmered in the light. A giant ray glided past as if I were nothing more than a shadow. It felt like stepping into another world. I decided then to make the most of it. A week in paradise was more than I could ask for. The outbreak began the night I was supposed to leave. At first, I didn't know what it was. The news came through on my tablet. Unexplained attacks in major cities. Authorities urged citizens to stay indoors. It sounded like the kind of sensationalist news I usually ignored. I laughed. Thinking of the irony, here I was, a man surrounded by the ocean, and the chaos was unfolding thousands of kilometers away. By morning, the news was different. Footage of people in the streets, eyes wild, limbs flailing, mouths open in screams. It took me a moment, staring at the screen in disbelief, to realize what I was seeing. People were not just sick, they were changed. Some news channels were already calling them infected, but the term didn't matter. The result was the same: death and destruction, fast. I tried to call the mainland office, but the lines were dead. Phones, emails, everything dead. The hotel staff moved strangely calm, almost too calm. The robots continued their duties without interruption, delivering breakfast, checking the filtration systems, restocking the pantry. It was unnerving how smooth everything ran, given the circumstances. By the third day, I understood the full extent. The mainland was gone, or at least overrun. I rarely saw the emergency updates anymore. The hotel had gone into some kind of automatic lockdown. The underwater isolation that had once felt like a novelty now felt like a fortress. The hotel had been built to sustain life for weeks without outside intervention, maybe even months. The kitchens were stocked with provisions for hundreds of guests. The filtration system purified water from the sea. Solar panels on the surface supplemented the generators. I didn't panic, not at first. Survival was less about adrenaline and more about accepting the reality and using what I had. The first week passed in a haze of routine. I maintained a strict schedule. Morning walks through the observation tubes, checking the supply rooms, reading in the lounge, while rays of light danced across the floor. I grew fascinated with the wildlife outside. Sharks, stingrays, schools of shimmering fish. Their presence was comforting in a way that humans no longer were. I did venture above occasionally, though reluctantly. Fishing was necessary. The hotel had stock, yes, but fishing gave me a reason to move, to feel the sun on my skin, to remind myself I was still alive. The surface air was thin and biting at first, but after a few days, it became addictive. I would sit for hours on the small platform by the inlet, letting the waves lap gently at my feet, thinking of the world that had disappeared. One day, I noticed something odd through the tube. A figure, or what looked like a figure, was floating near the surface. The water distorted it, but the posture was wrong, too stiff, too deliberate. And then I realized, these were zombies. They had somehow made it into the water, or at least had been carried by it. But as I watched, mesmerized and horrified, I realized the glass walls of the observation tubes rendered them harmless. They pressed against it, thrashed, but could not break through. It was a strange reassurance. I was isolated, yes, but not completely helpless. I began to walk the tubes at night, flashlight in hand, observing the strange ballet of predator and infected outside. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet, terrifying order. By the second week, I had settled into a rhythm that felt absurdly luxurious. I had food, water, shelter, and safety. My only threats were boredom and loneliness. I began to document my days in a journal, writing down observations of the wildlife, the strange behaviors of the infected, and my own spiraling thoughts. I never saw another human. Occasionally, I thought I glimpsed movement in the other hotels across the inlet, but the distance was too great to tell. Perhaps I was alone. Perhaps the hotel had been spared because it was remote. Or perhaps no one had survived. Fishing trips became my only excursions. I learned to move quietly, casting my line into the water with practiced patience. The sea was both friend and foe. It provided life and sustenance, yet always reminded me of the fragility of my existence. The infected sometimes floated near the shore, silent and lifeless in the water, a grotesque reminder that the world above was gone. The hotel's self-sufficiency became my obsession. I mapped out every system, every stockpile, every emergency protocol. I ran drills for potential failures, generator breakdown, water filtration issues, structural breaches. It was a comfort, knowing that I could handle almost anything the world threw at me so long as I remained calm and rational. And then, the first serious threat appeared. A storm, not the usual small, manageable storms I had encountered in my time on the ocean, but a full-blown tempest that rocked the inlet and battered the hotel with relentless waves. I secured the hatches, checked the supplies, and waited in the observation tube as the world outside turned violent. Fish scattered, the water churned, and I felt the isolation more acutely than ever. It was a test, one I survived, but it left a mark. I realized then that my paradise was fragile. As the storm passed and the sun rose over the rippling water, I made a decision. I would not remain passive. The world above was dangerous, yes, but I could not let fear dictate my existence. I would explore, cautiously, and take what I needed to maintain my health and sanity. I would not just survive, I would live. And so, I did. The days stretched into weeks, and the rhythm of life inside the underwater hotel became a strange kind of normal. I had settled into a schedule, one that balanced survival, exploration, and sanity. Mornings began with long walks through the observation tubes, watching the ocean world go about its quiet business. Schools of silver fish darted past in synchronized waves, while rays glided gracefully over the sandy ocean floor. Occasionally, I'd catch sight of a shark, a sleek and intimidating predator, but the glass walls of the tubes made them no threat. Watching them reminded me that, for all the chaos above, life had found a way to continue below. I had named some of the creatures. A massive grouper I saw frequently became Old Man Gray, while a pair of playful dolphins were the twins. It was ridiculous, yes, but the naming gave me a small sense of companionship. The hotel was designed for hundreds of guests, yet I was alone. The silence, once comforting, had begun to press against my skull in heavy waves. Giving personality to the wildlife was my way of keeping my mind tethered to reality. Fishing trips remained my only venture above the surface. I had rigged a small line with a pulley system, allowing me to haul fish efficiently without exposing myself to unnecessary risk. Most days, I would take the morning light, stand on the platform by the inlet, and cast into the water. The sun was harsh after weeks spent underwater, and the wind carried the tang of the ocean directly into my lungs. I welcomed it. I needed the warmth, the sensation of air moving over my skin, a reminder that I was still human. The first real challenge came from the outside world. One morning, as I prepared to leave my suite for a fishing trip, I noticed movement in the neighboring hotel across the inlet. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then a figure emerged from the upper deck unmistakably. My heart raced. For weeks, I had believed I was completely alone. Now, suddenly, I was confronted with the possibility of another survivor, or something worse. I watched for hours, hidden behind the tinted glass of my observation tube, my mind racing through scenarios. The figure moved cautiously, checking the doors and windows, as though aware that the world was no longer safe. I wanted to call out, to make contact, but something inside me hesitated. The risk was too great. I didn't know whether this person was friendly, desperate, or infected. The ocean, calm and beautiful as it was, suddenly felt like a barrier between two worlds, one safe, one uncertain. Days passed without further incident. The figure disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. I tried to dismiss it as a fleeting hallucination, a trick of isolation, but the memory lingered. I began reinforcing my routines, checking the locks on the hotel's entrances, reviewing the water filtration systems, counting every ration in the pantry. Every precaution became a ritual, a way to exert control in a world that had none. Life inside the hotel continued in quiet luxury. The robots kept up their work with mechanical precision, cleaning, restocking, and monitoring systems. I discovered the hydroponic garden in the lower levels, a space designed to provide fresh vegetables for guests. I began tending it myself, planting seeds, monitoring growth, and harvesting as needed. It was meditative work, grounding me in a reality that had been stripped of human touch. The wildlife outside became a source of both fascination and unease. The infected floated near the surface, pressed against the glass, in futile attempts to breach the hotel. Some days, I would watch them for hours, observing the way the water slowed their movements, rendering them harmless. Others, I would turn away, unable to confront the grotesque reminder of the chaos above. It was a strange mix of horror and beauty, the ocean sustaining life even as it carried death in its currents. One afternoon, I ventured further than usual. I climbed to the top deck, the wind whipping my hair back, and cast my fishing line into the deep water beyond the inlet. The sun was high, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine a world beyond the glass walls, a world where the chaos had ended. The thought was brief, fleeting, and almost painful. I was not yet ready to confront the truth that the mainland, my home, and everyone I knew might be gone forever. That evening, I returned to the observation tubes and discovered a new development. One of the fish species I had never noticed before had appeared a large, dark silhouette that glided through the water with deliberate grace. It was beautiful and terrifying, a predator in a world that was supposed to be my sanctuary. I watched it for hours, captivated by its movements, feeling a strange kinship with the creature. In a world stripped of human contact, connection with the natural world had become vital. The following weeks were a study in adaptation. I established a precise routine: morning fishing trips, hydroponic garden maintenance, observation tube walks, journal writing, and system checks. Each day I pushed myself to learn more about the hotel, the wildlife, and the limits of my isolation. I began experimenting with underwater excursions, exploring areas of the hotel that were rarely visited, and discovering hidden compartments stocked with emergency supplies. One night, during a particularly long observation tube walk, I heard a strange sound. It was a faint scratching, like fingernails against metal. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, straining to locate the source. The sound persisted, irregular, almost deliberate. I followed it cautiously, flashlight in hand, moving deeper into the network of tubes. The scratching grew louder, more urgent, and then I saw them. A small group of infected had managed to congregate at the edge of the hotel's outer perimeter, pressing against the thick glass in silent menace. Their movements were slow, ineffectual, but the sound of their claws scraping against the surface sent a chill down my spine. I had been watching them from a distance for weeks, but never this close. I backed away slowly, heart pounding, and returned to my suite. Sleep that night was elusive. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the subtle hum of the hotel's systems, trying to convince myself that I was safe. Rationally, I knew glass walls were thick. The water slowed their movements, but the primal part of me feared the inevitability of eventual contact. The world above was lost, and the infected were a reminder of that loss, always lurking just beyond the fragile barrier of my sanctuary. By the end of the second month, I had grown comfortable with the patterns of life and death around me. The ocean was both a shield and a threat, offering sustenance while hiding dangers I had yet to fully comprehend. I learned to fish in deeper waters, using longer lines and weighted hooks to reach areas teeming with life. I expanded the hydroponic garden, experimenting with crops I had never grown before. I even began marking the observation tubes with small notes, tracking the movement of the infected, the migration of fish, and the changing tides. Yet, despite all this, the sense of loneliness remained. I spoke aloud to the creatures I named, wrote letters to imagined friends, and read aloud to myself from books I had brought along. The hotel, with all its self-sufficiency and technological marvels, could not replace human contact. I realized then that survival was not just about sustenance and safety, it was about connection, and in that respect, I was profoundly isolated. And so, I adapted. I became a careful observer, a meticulous planner, and a cautious explorer. The hotel had given me life, but I had to give it purpose. I would survive, yes, but survival alone was not enough. The hotel had become my entire world. Every surface, every tube, every corner I had explored repeatedly, until I knew its layout by memory. The observation tubes, once a marvel, had become my private corridors, a place to lose myself and watch the ocean move in its quiet, unstoppable rhythm. Yet, as the weeks passed, I began to notice the small signs that nothing, not even this fortress of glass and steel, was perfect. It started with the filtration system. I had been walking the lower maintenance corridors, checking the water flow and nutrient cycles in the hydroponics garden, when I noticed a subtle drop in pressure. At first, I ignored it, assuming a temporary malfunction. But by the next day, the water was murkier in places, and the automated sensors flagged anomalies I hadn't seen before. I descended into the maintenance hub, flashlight cutting through the dim green glow, and traced the issue to one of the intake valves on the exterior wall. A crack, hairline at first glance, but enough that salt water could seep in if pressure increased. My stomach sank. The hotel had been designed to withstand hurricanes, storms, even minor seismic activity, but I had never considered the possibility of slow, insidious wear. I patched it temporarily, using the materials stored for emergency repairs. It was enough to keep the water from entering the hotel, but I knew it was a stopgap. This fortress, perfect as it seemed, was still vulnerable. The realization gnawed at me in a way the isolation never had. The outside world, with its infected and storms and uncertainty, was always pressing in, even here. The psychological strain became evident the next week. I started speaking more often to myself, narrating my movements aloud, even making notes for future me in my journal. I caught myself imagining conversations with other survivors, imaginary figures who existed only to break the silence that now pressed against my ears. One night, I awoke to the sound of scratching again. Not from the tubes this time, but the maintenance hatch near the lower storage levels. Heart hammering, I grabbed a wrench and crept down the metal staircase, muscles taut and senses alert. The scratching had stopped when I arrived, leaving only the faint echo of metal on metal. I checked the storage area, every crate and supply box, every robot performing its cleaning duties. Nothing was out of place. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was fatigue, paranoia, a byproduct of too many weeks alone. But the unease lingered. It didn't take long for the real threat to reveal itself. One afternoon, I decided to venture to the surface, beyond the inlet, to fish in deeper waters. The sky was calm, almost serene, a deceptive tranquility that often precedes danger. I leaned over the edge of the platform, casting my line far into the open water. Hours passed in meditative silence, the rod bending slightly as fish nibbled at the bait. And then, something heavy thumped against the hull of the hotel. At first, I thought it was a rogue piece of debris floating on the waves, but the thumping continued, deliberate and rhythmic. My stomach dropped as I realized it wasn't debris. Something or someone was trying to breach the exterior walls. I scrambled back inside, heart racing, moving through the corridors with practiced caution. The maintenance monitors showed nothing. The hotel systems hadn't detected an external force strong enough to register. Yet I had felt it, heard it. My mind raced through possibilities. Another survivor? A structural failure? Or the infected, somehow coordinating in a way I had never seen before? From the observation tube, I peered into the water. There they were, dozens of them, floating near the surface, thrashing against the glass, attempting to climb, push, and breach. Their movements were slow but relentless, pressing against the barrier with a persistence I had never witnessed. The sight was horrifying. The ocean, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. I spent the next few days fortifying the hotel. Every hatch was secured, every window double-checked, and the maintenance robots were redirected to reinforce weak points. I learned to move silently, to monitor the movement of the infected through the observation tubes, noting their patterns, anticipating the moments when they would press against the walls. The isolation had become a survival advantage. I could react with precision without the chaos that human company often brought. Yet, even as I reinforced the hotel, another problem arose. Resources were finite. The hydroponic garden, once a source of abundance, could only stretch so far without proper nutrient replenishment. Fish populations in the immediate inlet began to decline as I harvested daily. I realized I would need to venture farther from the hotel, taking greater risks to sustain my life. The thought of leaving the relative safety of the glass walls filled me with dread. Every trip above water was a gamble, every excursion a potential death sentence, and yet I had no choice. Survival demanded action, and action demanded courage. On the third week after the breach attempt, I ventured farther than ever before. I rigged a small dinghy, stocked with provisions, and paddled silently beyond the inlet into open water. The sea was darker here, deeper, and alive with unknown creatures. Shadows moved beneath me, some small and harmless, others large and predatory. The wind carried a faint scent of decay, a reminder of the chaos that had consumed the mainland. Hours passed. I caught enough fish to replenish my stores for a month, and when I returned, I noticed something strange in the observation tubes, a subtle vibration, almost imperceptible, as though something massive had passed nearby. My heart sank. The ocean, my sanctuary, had become a place of unpredictability. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, the hum of the filtration system, the distant thrashing of the infected, the creak of metal joints, kept me alert. I realized that living in paradise, even one as self-sufficient and secure as this hotel, was not the same as living without danger. The world outside had changed, and I was still very much a part of it, whether I liked it or not. I began to adapt again, this time mentally rather than physically. The hotel systems were my lifeline, but I needed routines that would preserve my sanity. I cataloged the infected movements, marked safe fishing zones, tracked the tides and currents. I began crafting small tools and devices, improvising ways to improve efficiency and security. Each task became a ritual, a way to focus my mind and stave off the creeping paranoia that came with prolonged isolation. And yet, despite all my precautions, I knew the threat was still there. Every thump against the glass, every shadow passing through the tubes, was a reminder that I was not invincible. The infected could not penetrate the hotel, but they could outlast me. Time was not on my side. I learned to accept it. Survival was no longer just about physical safety. It was about patience, vigilance, and the ability to adapt to a world that had forgotten order. The weeks bled into months, and I realized something I had refused to admit before. The hotel, for all its luxury and technological marvels, could not keep the outside world entirely at bay. The ocean was both my savior and my tormentor. It gave me life, sustenance, and beauty. Yet it reminded me daily that I was isolated, encased in glass, while the world above had descended into chaos. I began to notice subtle changes. The wildlife that had once been a source of comfort now sometimes seemed predatory in ways I hadn't noticed before. Schools of fish darted nervously whenever the infected drifted near the surface. The occasional shark moved closer to the observation tubes, eyes glinting, as though testing the barrier between me and the ocean. I had grown to respect them, but the fear was there nonetheless. Fishing trips became more dangerous. The fish in the inlet were dwindling, forcing me to venture farther from the hotel. I rigged a small dinghy with flotation aids and stocked it with emergency rations. Each trip was meticulously planned, accounting for currents, wind, and the potential appearance of infected floating near the surface. One afternoon, as I drifted silently into deeper water, I saw a cluster of movement on the horizon. At first, I thought it was debris, but the rhythm of motion, jerky, uneven, unmistakably human, made my blood run cold. It was another group of survivors, or so I assumed. I dared not approach. Years of stories, movies, and warnings had trained me to treat unknown humans as far more dangerous than any infected. But the thought of contact, of hearing another voice that was not my own, clawed at something deep inside me. For a fleeting moment, I imagined joining them, sharing resources, stories, and hope. Then I remembered the logic. I had food, water, shelter, and safety. They had uncertainty, danger, and desperation. My sanctuary was worth more than fleeting companionship. The psychological strain grew heavier. I spoke more to the animals outside the tubes, giving them personalities and stories to fill the void of human interaction. I wrote letters I would never send, recounting days, fears, and small victories. I read books aloud, narrating my life as though I were hosting an invisible audience. Sometimes I caught myself laughing at my own words, the sound bouncing off the glass like a companion I could not touch. One night, during a routine walk through the tubes, I noticed something that made my heart stop. A small crack had formed in one of the outer panels, a tiny fissure at first, almost invisible in the dim light. My stomach nodded. I had patched one crack months ago, but I had never imagined another appearing without storm damage or structural stress. I moved quickly, sealing off the affected section with temporary reinforcements. The hotel's engineering systems indicated that the damage was minor, but the mental toll was significant. The invincibility I had felt in this fortress had been shattered. The ocean, beautiful and hypnotic, was indifferent to my existence. It did not protect me. It only allowed me to survive so long as I respected it. Storms became my nemesis. One week, a violent squall tore across the inlet, waves battering the hotel with a relentless fury. The observation tubes shook with every gust, and I could see the ocean roiling with whitecaps and chaos. I secured the hatches, double-checked the emergency supplies, and waited. Hours passed in tense silence, punctuated by the groaning of metal and the hiss of salt water against reinforced panels. When the storm finally passed, I emerged to assess the damage. Debris had washed against the hotel, leaving small scratches and dents. My patched crack had held, but I realized that time and nature were enemies I could not outsmart indefinitely. Survival was not a permanent state, it was a series of calculated actions, and every day brought new variables. I also discovered another consequence of isolation: dreams. They had started subtly, first as fragments of memories or distorted scenes of the mainland. Then they became more vivid, almost tangible. I would wake in a cold sweat, convinced I had heard voices or footsteps in the corridors. Sometimes I imagined seeing someone walking across the observation tubes, only to remember the tubes were empty and the hotel had been abandoned except for me. The loneliness gnawed at my mind. It was not fear of the infected or the storms. It was the knowledge that my world had shrunk to a transparent bubble under the sea. I had everything I needed for survival, but human contact, the chaotic, imperfect reality of interaction, was missing. My journal became my confidant, the fish my audience, the ocean my silent witness. Then, the first unmistakable threat from above surfaced. I had ventured to the surface for fishing, farther than ever before, when I noticed something floating on the horizon. Debris, at first glance. But as I approached, the shape resolved into a raft with two figures aboard. They were alive, moving cautiously, scanning the water. I froze. My heart pounded as I realized these were not infected, they were human. Instinct screamed at me to hide, to retreat. Yet a part of me, the part starved for contact, wanted to signal, to wave, to prove that life existed beyond isolation. I remained still, watching as the figures paddled closer. The wind shifted, carrying faint shouts and the rhythmic splash of paddles. I studied them, noting the tattered clothing, the crude makeshift weapons, the way they scanned the water for threats. I returned to the hotel without being noticed, heart hammering. The encounter changed something. I knew I was not the only survivor, and the possibility of human contact, of negotiation or confrontation, became real. My sanctuary, once complete, was now vulnerable not just to nature and the infected, but to other humans. That night, I walked the tubes in silence, observing the ocean and the faint glow of the other hotels across the inlet. I realized something crucial: survival would not be enough. I would need to adapt, not just to storms and zombies, but to the complexity of human behavior and the unpredictability of the world above. Isolation had taught me patience, vigilance, and resourcefulness, but it could not teach me everything. I had grown strong, capable, and cautious, but alone. Now, the unknown loomed, just beyond the horizon, a reminder that paradise could not exist in perpetuity. And I knew, deep down, that the next chapter of this existence would not be written in solitude. It would be written in confrontation with the ocean, with the infected, and with the living. The days after the sighting of the raft were a blur of calculation and unease. The hotel, once a predictable sanctuary, now seemed fragile. A glass shell floating in a world teetering between chaos and survival. I couldn't stop thinking about the humans I had seen alive, breathing, moving with intent. Unlike the infected, they could reason, fight, and make choices. That uncertainty terrified me more than any storm or horde ever could. I started preparing. The hydroponic garden and food stores were sufficient for now, but I could not rely on passivity. I fortified weak points in the observation tubes, reinforced hatches, and set up rudimentary alarm triggers using pressure plates and loose panels that would alert me to any intrusion. My movements became deliberate, calculated, almost ritualistic. I could not afford mistakes. Fishing trips became reconnaissance missions. I paddled farther, moving with the current and the wind, scanning the horizon for rafts, debris, or other signs of life. Every time I caught sight of a shadow on the water, my pulse spiked. Once, a lone figure drifted into view, standing on a jagged piece of wreckage. They waved, and I froze. Conflicted between curiosity and caution, I didn't respond. Isolation had begun to warp my perception. I imagined footsteps echoing in the tubes when none existed. I imagined figures moving across the hotel corridors, whispering, watching. My journal filled with detailed maps of the hotel, diagrams of the tubes, and notes on the infected patterns outside, but also with imagined conversations and warnings to future me. I knew this was the beginning of a psychological breaking point. The solitude, once a comfort, had become a trap of the mind. Then came the storm, the one that truly tested the hotel's limits. It began as a low rumble in the distance, barely noticeable over the hum of the generators. By mid-morning, the clouds had thickened, dark as ink, and wind ripped across the surface of the inlet. I secured the hatches, double-checked the emergency supplies, and descended into the maintenance corridors. The hotel shuddered under the force of the waves. I clung to the railing, flashlight in hand, watching the water churn violently outside the tubes. The infected, usually slow and inert underwater, were caught in the current. I watched as dozens of them thrashed against the glass, swept up by surges, and slammed against the reinforced panels. I realized then that the hotel's isolation was both protection and a trap. The water now carried not just sustenance, but danger, force, and unpredictability. Hours passed. The storm raged. I moved from one tube to another, checking structural integrity, shoring up weak points, monitoring the automated systems. I had learned to trust the hotel's engineering, but there were limits. The vibrations of the storm shook even the thickest glass, and I felt a gnawing sense of helplessness I had not experienced before. When dawn came, the storm had passed. The hotel had survived intact, though a section of the lower observation tubes had sustained minor damage. I assessed the damage, patched cracks, and reinforced the area. The experience left me shaken. Survival was no longer just about routine. It demanded constant vigilance, adaptability, and mental fortitude. The storm also revealed something else: the raft. It had drifted closer to the hotel, grounded on a shallow patch of the inlet. I could see the two figures clearly now, both huddled and shivering. Their presence was a puzzle. Were they friend or foe? Desperate survivors or scavengers? I observed from the tubes, hidden, debating my next move. Days passed before I acted. I waited, watching the tide, studying their movements. Finally, I decided to approach carefully. Using my dinghy, I paddled toward the raft under the cover of morning fog. My pulse raced, every muscle coiled for sudden action. When I arrived, they looked up, startled. I raised my hands in a gesture of peace, keeping the makeshift spear I carried at my side. "Who are you?" I called, voice echoing across the water. They froze. Then, cautiously, one of them spoke. We're survivors. We didn't mean any trouble." I studied them, noting their wounds, their makeshift clothing, the desperation in their eyes. They were starving, weak, and ill-equipped for life in this world. I felt a pang of empathy but also fear. Inviting them aboard the hotel could compromise everything I had built, everything I had survived. Yet leaving them here would be morally impossible. After long deliberation, I allowed them to approach the hotel, guiding them to a small platform just outside one of the reinforced doors. I monitored their movements, ensuring they could not reach the inner corridors without my supervision. They were careful, trembling, exhausted. I offered them food and water, watching their gratitude and relief, with a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. For the first time in months, I spoke at length with another human. Their stories were fragmented, filled with loss and horror, but also resilience. We exchanged names, shared brief histories, and established ground rules for coexistence. My sanctuary, once solitary, was now a shared space. Trust had become a necessity, and with it, risk. The presence of others brought a subtle shift in the hotel's dynamic. I was no longer the sole observer, the lone caretaker of the ocean. Cooperation became essential, and I found myself delegating small tasks, tending the hydroponic garden, checking supplies, reinforcing weak points. The survivors adapted quickly, learning routines and patterns, but the psychological tension was palpable. Fear, distrust, and survival instincts simmered beneath every interaction. The infected, ever present outside, became a shared concern. We observed them together, noting patterns, studying behavior, and anticipating potential breaches. The ocean had become a stage of constant observation, a theater of life and death, where we were both actors and audience. By the end of this chapter, I realized a crucial truth. The hotel had kept me alive, but it had also kept me complacent. Survival, I understood now, was not merely about isolation or security. It was about adaptability, vigilance, and human connection even when that connection brought risk. The next steps would require courage, foresight, and perhaps the most dangerous gamble of all, venturing beyond the inlet into the open ocean to reclaim a semblance of the world that had been lost. Life in the hotel had changed. What had once been a quiet, almost serene existence under the waves had shifted into a tense equilibrium. The two survivors I had taken in Lena and Marcus were competent and cautious, but their presence introduced uncertainty. Every movement, every action, every conversation was now a negotiation. Trust had to be earned daily, and even then, it was fragile. Fishing became more complicated. With three of us consuming resources, the inlet was no longer enough. I had to venture further into open water, past the currents and hidden shoals where danger lurked beneath every shadow. Marcus and Lena often joined me, rowing silently in our dinghy as we drifted into the deep, scanning the water for both prey and threat. The infected had begun drifting farther, some caught by the tides, some moving deliberately, testing boundaries. They were an ever-present reminder of the world's unpredictability. The hydroponic garden was another source of tension. Crops grew slower than expected, nutrient levels fluctuated, and small infestations of pests occasionally threatened yields. We argued over priorities, how much to harvest, which plants to prioritize, how to ration the limited supply of water and nutrients. It was strange to argue in a place that had been designed for comfort, where scarcity was not supposed to exist, yet scarcity had arrived anyway, a consequence of human presence and time. One morning, I awoke to a minor panic. Marcus had ventured into the lower maintenance corridors while inspecting the filtration system, and found that one of the secondary generators had begun to fail. If it went completely offline, parts of the hotel's water and power systems could shut down, leaving us vulnerable. I quickly coordinated repairs, Marcus working alongside me, Lena monitoring the observation tubes for any movement outside. The repairs were tense, the generator was old, and some components had corroded despite the hotel's automated maintenance. Sparks flew, metal hissed, and the hum of machinery faltered. For hours, we worked in silence, adrenaline keeping our hands steady. Finally, the generator roared back to life. Relief washed over us, but it was a fragile relief. The hotel's systems were finite, and each day brought new threats: storms, infected, human error, and the slow decay of technology. The psychological strain was palpable. Lena began keeping a journal. Marcus muttered constantly to himself, and I found myself staring at the ocean for hours, observing the patterns of fish and infected alike. Sometimes I imagined voices in the water, whispers from a world I could no longer touch. Dreams, too, had begun to torment me more frequently. Nightmares of flooded corridors, glass shattering, and the infected swarming the observation tubes. Then came the first direct confrontation. We had paddled into a deeper inlet, following the currents where fish were abundant. As I prepared to cast my line, I noticed movement near the hotel's edge. A group of 3 humans, clearly armed with crude spears and knives, approaching silently in a small raft. They were desperate, scavengers, and they had spotted our hotel. I signaled Lena and Marcus, retreating toward the safety of the hotel's reinforced entry. The strangers had not yet seen the reinforced doors, but it was only a matter of minutes before curiosity or aggression would drive them closer. My mind raced. Should we confront them? Signal them? Hide and hope they passed by? I chose caution. We retreated to a higher observation tube, invisible from the surface, and watched. The scavengers drifted closer, peering into the water, tapping the glass in curiosity. One of them waved, but there was no smile, no warmth in the gesture, only desperation and hunger. I could feel the tension in the water, a current of threat that had nothing to do with the ocean itself. The hours stretched. The scavengers eventually drifted away, their curiosity unsatisfied, or perhaps they had sensed the danger of our walls. But the encounter left a lasting impression. The hotel was no longer a private sanctuary. The world above was encroaching, bringing with it moral dilemmas and tangible risk. I spent the following days preparing for contingencies. We reinforced the entry points, created simple barricades in the observation tubes, and mapped every path the scavengers could take if they returned. Marcus experimented with signaling devices, simple systems to warn us if humans approached, while Lena and I focused on food rationing and maintaining the garden. We were no longer simply surviving, we were preparing for siege. The infected continued their slow, relentless patterns outside, pressing occasionally against the tubes, testing boundaries without understanding the limits. Their presence became routine again, almost secondary to the human threat. And yet, they were always a reminder. The glass walls could hold, but the world beyond them was indifferent to survival. I began to understand something crucial about isolation and community. Human contact was necessary, but fraught with danger. The hotel, as perfect as it seemed, could not protect us from every eventuality. Survival was no longer just about food, water, or shelter. It was about strategy, anticipation, and mental resilience. By the end of the 6th month, the hotel had become a living, breathing organism in our minds. Every tube, every corridor, every observation window was mapped, monitored, and catalogued. Every fish, every shadow, every surge of water was noted. We were no longer visitors in this underwater sanctuary, we were its caretakers, its wardens, and its guardians. And the world outside was coming for us. The warning signs had been subtle at first, a distant rumble, a shift in the currents, the faint vibration of the ocean against the hotel's hull. But by the 7th month, the threats converged. A storm unlike any I had experienced before bore down on the inlet, waves smashing against the glass tubes and the surface platforms, while the scavengers I had seen months ago returned with intent, their raft cutting through the churning water toward our sanctuary. I watched from the upper observation tube as Marcus and Lena secured the lower levels, reinforcing the hydroponics garden and barricading vulnerable panels. The wind shrieked across the hotel's metal frame, shaking it like a child's toy. Saltwater spray hit the windows, temporarily obscuring the ocean from view. Outside, the infected were caught in the maelstrom, their slow, relentless presses against the glass now chaotic, thrashing in every direction. We had no choice. Survival demanded action. I directed Marcus to prepare defensive tools, makeshift spears, weighted nets, and devices to block potential entry points. Lena and I monitored the scavengers' approach, noting every twitch of their raft, every sound carried by the wind. They had seen the hotel before, and now they were desperate, driven by hunger and desperation. Unlike the infected, they could strategize, adapt, and attack. The storm intensified. A massive wave slammed into the hotel's exterior, rattling the reinforced doors and sending vibrations down the tubes. The generators hummed under strain, lights flickering as the power system struggled to compensate for the increased demand. The hydroponics pumps sputtered, but I had anticipated this. Temporary power rerouting kept the plants alive, just barely. The scavengers reached the hotel. They pounded on the reinforced doors, attempting to climb the platforms despite the wind and waves. Their desperation was palpable, every shout and slam echoing in the hollow corridors. They were resourceful, dangerous, but limited. They could not breach the reinforced glass, could not survive the waves if they fell into the water. Their challenge was psychological as much as physical. They were testing, probing, hoping for weakness. Marcus and Lena moved efficiently, deploying the makeshift barriers we had prepared, while I coordinated from the tubes. We were a team now, 3 humans against a world of chaos, isolated but not powerless. I realized then that the months of solitude had prepared me for this moment, not in comfort, but in resilience, vigilance, and clarity of thought. Hours passed in a tense standoff. The storm hammered the hotel, waves breaking over the platform, water seeping into minor cracks. The scavengers continued their assault, their shouts rising above the wind. Inside, we moved with precision, patching small breaches, reinforcing weak points, and keeping the infected at bay outside the tubes. At one point, the hotel groaned ominously, a low vibration that ran through the metal framework. My heart skipped a beat. I looked to Marcus and Lena, seeing the same fear mirrored in their eyes, but also determination. We were 3 people, isolated from the world, yet united in purpose. Survival demanded everything we had, and more. As the storm reached its peak, a rogue wave struck, smashing the railing on the platform and threatening to capsize the scavengers' raft. I watched them struggle. The wave took care of them, tossing the raft and scattering its occupants as they were carried into the ocean. It was brutal, indiscriminate, but the natural forces of the world had intervened in our favor. The storm passed slowly, leaving the hotel battered but intact. The water had calmed, the sky cleared, and the ocean returned to its quiet, hypnotic rhythm. The infected remained outside, slow and inert once more, pressing occasionally against the glass, in a futile test of their limits. Inside, we were exhausted, but alive. In the aftermath, the hotel felt different. We had survived, yes, but the experience had changed us. Marcus and Lena were no longer just companions. They were partners in a delicate balance of survival. I realized that isolation had taught me resilience, but connection had given me strength. The hotel's luxury and self-sufficiency had been vital, but it was human ingenuity, coordination, and courage that had seen us through the storm and the siege. We began to rebuild. Damaged areas were repaired, rations carefully assessed, and routines reestablished. I walked the observation tubes at night, watching the ocean, reflecting on what we had endured. The infected were still there, the world above still dangerous, but we had proven something vital, that survival was more than instinct. It was strategy, vigilance, and the will to endure against impossible odds. By the 8th month, the hotel had become a home, a fortress, and a laboratory of human resilience. We had food, water, and security. But more importantly, we had each other. Isolation had been broken, not by chance, but by necessity. We had faced storms, scavengers, and the relentless presence of death itself, and we had survived. The ocean outside continued its silent rhythms, vast and indifferent, a reminder that life continued in all its forms, above and below the waves. The hotel, a gleaming bubble of humanity beneath the sea, had endured, and so had we. I realized then that paradise was not the absence of danger, but the ability to thrive within it, in a world gone mad. Marcus, Lena, and I moved with precision, tending the hydroponic garden, monitoring the observation tubes, and keeping watch over the ever-present infected outside. Life had slowed, sharpened, and focused itself into purpose. The ocean had become our constant companion, its vastness both beautiful and humbling. I spent hours walking the tubes at night, observing the muted glow of deep-water fish, the haunting silhouette of rays gliding above the sandy floor, and the slow, futile movements of the infected pressed against the glass. I had come to realize that beneath the waves, time had a different weight. Threats moved slower, death was present but less immediate, and survival demanded patience as much as action. We established routines that were sustainable, almost meditative. Mornings were spent tending crops and checking systems. Afternoons were dedicated to fishing or exploring the surrounding ocean, venturing carefully into deeper waters. Evenings became a time of reflection, storytelling, and laughter, small sparks of humanity in a world that had lost so much. Occasionally, we spotted other hotels across the inlet, the same structures I had once observed alone. They were abandoned, silent shells, empty of life. I imagined the people who had once visited, the laughter, the comfort, and the chaos that had vanished in a matter of days. The memory was bittersweet, a reminder of the world we had lost, and of the fragile nature of civilization. Months turned into years. Our skills grew, and so did our understanding of the environment. The hotel's automated systems had stabilized, the hydroponic garden became abundant, and our fishing trips yielded enough to sustain us indefinitely. We became observers of the ocean's rhythms, mapping schools of fish, noting patterns of currents, and even predicting the slow movements of the infected. What had once been terrifying became part of the rhythm of life, a strange coexistence of danger and beauty. Marcus and Lena became more than companions. They became family. We established clear boundaries, routines, and protocols, balancing cooperation with personal space. There was laughter, arguments, reconciliation, and shared triumphs. One day, as I walked the observation tube alone, I watched the sunlight filter through the water, illuminating a school of silverfish in a dazzling dance. For a moment, the world felt suspended in perfect clarity. I realized how far we had come from terrified isolation to controlled survival, from solitude to a fragile, enduring community. The ocean had not changed. It remained vast, indifferent, and magnificent. But we had adapted. We had mastered our small corner of it, not through domination, but through understanding, patience, and courage. I looked at the upper levels of the hotel, where Marcus and Lena were working on reinforcing a minor hatch. Their voices carried faintly through the water, laughter and conversation blending with the hum of the hotel's systems. I felt a profound sense of peace, tempered by the awareness that the world above remained chaotic and dangerous. Yet that awareness no longer brought fear, it brought clarity. We were alive, we were together, and we had built something lasting beneath the waves. The infected floated in the water outside, slow and harmless against the reinforced glass. The storms came and went, the currents shifted, and the tides rose and fell. But the hotel endured, and so did we. The ocean was vast, the world unpredictable, but in this bubble beneath the waves, we had found mastery, purpose, and life itself. As the sun set, casting golden rays through the water and illuminating the silent beauty of the ocean floor, I understood the truth of our existence. Survival was not just about safety, not just about isolation. It was about adaptation, connection, and the courage to thrive where others had fallen. The underwater hotel, once a mere refuge, had become a testament to resilience, ingenuity, and the enduring spark of humanity. And in that quiet, suspended world beneath the waves, we were alive and we were free.